On the morning Marlene Voss came down my south lane on a four-wheeler, I had already taken away the one thing she thought her neighborhood owned. There were 6 fresh concrete posts standing across the gap in my fence, grey as tombstones and twice as stubborn, and behind them ran a brand new line of woven wire, pulled so tight it hummed when the wind came across the field. Marlene killed the engine, took off her sunglasses, looked at the barrier, then looked at me standing there with a coffee mug in one hand and my old brown work gloves in the other. She said, "Walter, you cannot close the road." I said, "Marlene, it was never a road. It was just a place my father was too polite to say no." That was October of 1998, outside Fairmont, Ohio, back when a man could still buy a decent truck for less than 20 grand, get a full tank of gas without checking his bank account first, and argue with his neighbors face-to-face instead of through a screen. I was 57 years old then, retired from the tool and die shop at the Ford plant in Dayton, running hay on 73 acres of ground my father bought in 1962. It was not fancy land, not the kind that ended up in glossy real estate magazines with a young couple in matching sweaters standing beside a horse they did not know how to saddle. It was working land. It had a hayfield, a patch of woods, a low creek that flooded every spring, an old tobacco barn my father had converted into a machine shed, and a pond where I had caught the same fat bluegill every summer for nearly 15 years. My dad, Harlan Boone, used to say, good land did not have to be pretty every day. He said good land had to feed something, shelter something, or stand by you when the weather turned ugly. Most of the time, that land had done all 3 for our family. The trouble began when the old McNally orchard west of my place got sold to a developer in 1995. For years, that orchard had been nothing but old apple trees, rusted irrigation pipe, and a couple of mule deer that acted like they had been paying property taxes. Then one spring, bulldozers came through, the apple trees disappeared, and a new subdivision started rising up where the orchard had been. They called it Hickory Landing, which was funny because there was not much of a landing and not many hickory trees either, but that was how those developers did things. They gave a place a name that sounded like a fishing lodge, planted a wooden sign with gold letters by the road, and sold city people a picture of country life with just enough gravel in the driveway to make them feel adventurous. By 1997, there were 52 houses back there, most of them owned by folks who drove into Columbus or Dayton for work, came home late, and wanted to spend Saturday morning pretending they lived on the farm. I did not blame them for that. I understood it. People wanted quiet. They wanted trees. They wanted their kids to ride bikes without hearing sirens all night. The problem was, some of them wanted all that country living without understanding that the country belonged to somebody before they got there. On the east side of my property sat Pine Run Reservoir, a county lake with walking trails, fishing docks, and a little patch of public woods that people used for turkey hunting when the season opened. It was not a big lake, but it was pretty, especially at dusk. You could see the water through the trees, and in early June the frogs got loud enough to make it sound like the whole county had turned into one long electrical hum. To get from Hickory Landing to Pine Run by road, residents had to drive almost 3 miles around the old state highway. It took maybe 10 minutes if traffic was light, 15 if you got behind a gravel truck or one of those school buses that stopped every 100 feet. But there was another way, a shorter way, and that was through my south hayfield. A dirt lane ran along the edge of the woods, crossed one shallow dip in the ground, passed behind my old barn, then came out near the county lake fence. My father had used that lane to haul seed and equipment years before, but after he stopped farming full-time, it mostly became grass and tire tracks. In the early 90s, before Hickory Landing ever existed, a few local families had asked Dad if they could walk across the corner of the property to fish. He usually said yes. Dad had been raised during the Depression, and people from that generation treated a request differently than people do now. Somebody asked to borrow a ladder, you handed them a ladder. Somebody needed a place to turn a truck around, you pointed to the gravel pad. Somebody wanted to walk through the back field to fish with their grandson, you said sure, just close the gate behind you. He never wrote any of it down. He did not think he had to. The word of a man still meant something to him, and honestly, most of the time it did. Dad died in 1996, right after Thanksgiving, and I still remember standing in the machine shed 1 week later, looking at his old red International tractor, thinking there were 100 things I had meant to ask him, and none of them mattered anymore, because the only person who knew the answer was gone. When you lose a parent, people tell you time helps. Maybe it does. What nobody tells you is that time also uncovers little problems they handled quietly for years. Things you never noticed because they stood between you and the trouble. One of those little problems was that lane. At first, I did not think much about it. I knew a few people used it to get to the reservoir. I would see somebody walking past the barn with a fishing pole, maybe an older couple with a dog on a leash, maybe kids carrying tackle boxes. I let it go because it seemed harmless, and because a part of me still felt like I was honoring Dad every time I let somebody cut across the corner of the field. Then the four-wheelers started. Not one or two, not just the occasional guy heading to the lake with a fishing rod strapped to the back rack. I started seeing tire marks after rain, mud ruts in the grass, soda cans tossed in the ditch by the old walnut tree. Somebody even drove through the shallow corner of the hayfield one spring and chewed up enough ground that my baler bounced like it was crossing railroad tracks. I knew where it was coming from. Hickory Landing. Still, I tried to be patient. I put a simple wooden sign at the edge of the lane that said PRI Fate Property. Walking AC quests only, no motorized vehicles. I thought that was fair. I did not shut the lane down. I did not shut the lane down. I did not chain the gate. I did not call the sheriff. I just made it plain that four-wheelers, dirt bikes, and people treating my hayfield like a county trail were not welcome. That sign lasted 9 days. Somebody knocked it down, dragged it through the mud, and left it in the creek. I found it on a Sunday morning while I was checking the fence. The letters were scratched up, one corner was split, and there was a muddy boot print right across the word PRV8. I stood there looking at it for a while, and I remember thinking, well, Dad, I guess we have entered a different kind of neighborhood now. A week later, I put up another sign, this one on a metal post set in concrete. That one lasted longer, almost 3 weeks. Then I found it lying flat in the weeds with the bolts removed. Not bent, not broken, not knocked down by a storm. Removed, cleanly, like somebody had taken the time to bring tools. That was when I called Earl Puckett, who lived on the property north of mine and had been delivering mail in Fairmont for 32 years before he retired. Earl knew everything that happened in the county before most people knew it happened to them. He came over around noon in his old green Chevy, climbed out with a thermos under one arm, looked at the missing signpost and said, "Well, Walter, somebody around here has either got a grudge or a screwdriver." I said, "You hear anything from Hickory Landing?" Earl took a sip of coffee and looked toward the subdivision. "People have been talking about that lake access. Some of them think it belongs to the development. I heard a few folks say the brochure showed a trail." "A brochure," I said. "That is what they are using now." Earl shrugged. "You know how people are. Put a dotted line on a drawing and suddenly somebody thinks the dotted line came with the mortgage." That was the first time I heard Marlene Voss's name connected to the problem. Marlene was the president of the Hickory Landing Homeowners Association. She was 45, maybe 46, had moved in 2 years earlier with her husband and teenage son. I had met her once at the grocery store. She seemed friendly enough then, the kind of person who smiled with her whole face and called everybody by their first name after meeting them once. She had worked in an insurance office in Columbus, Earl told me, and she was the kind of woman who could organize a bake sale, a yard sale, and a town hall meeting before most people finished breakfast. She was not lazy. She was not stupid. That was part of the trouble. A lazy person might have ignored my field. A stupid person might have gotten scared when I told them no. Marlene had energy, confidence, and a whole neighborhood behind her. 3 days after Earl came by, she showed up at my house in a navy blue Jeep Cherokee with a Hickory Landing decal on the back window. She parked by the barn, came up the porch steps in loafers that had never seen mud, and rang the bell. I opened the door and she gave me a smile that told me she had already rehearsed the conversation in her car. "Walter," she said, "I am glad I caught you. I wanted to talk about the access trail." I said, "Which access trail?" She smiled again, but tighter this time. "The trail that connects our neighborhood to Pine Run." "You mean my hayfield?" "Well, technically, yes. It crosses your land." "Then I guess we are talking about my hayfield." She crossed her arms. "The residents have been using that path for years." She crossed her arms. "The residents have been using that path for years." "Some people have," I said, "with my father's permission, and the community has come to rely on it. That is not the same thing as owning it." She looked around the porch, like she was checking whether anybody else could hear us. Then she said, "The developer showed residents a map with access to the reservoir. Families bought homes based on that." I said, "Then you need to talk to the developer." She said, "The developer is gone. That does not make me the developer." That was the first real crack in the wall between us. I could see it in her face. Marlene believed Hickory Landing had been cheated. Maybe they had. Maybe some salesman with a shiny tie and a brochure full of watercolor sketches had pointed at a green strip on a map and told buyers they would have easy lake access. I never saw the brochure. Maybe it existed. Maybe it did not. But even if it did, my name was not on it, and neither was my signature. I told her I would allow people to walk through if they respected the property, stayed on the lane, and stopped using motorized vehicles. I told her there would be no organized events, no ATV traffic, no trail maintenance days, no people cutting branches or moving fences because they thought they were doing me a favor. She nodded, but I could tell she did not hear the part about no. She heard the word walk and decided it was the beginning of a negotiation. 2 weeks later, I found out Hickory Landing was holding a community trail cleanup day on my property. I did not hear it from Marlene. I heard it from Orlen. I heard it from Earl, who had seen flyers taped up by the neighborhood mailbox cluster. The flyer said, "A Tuesday morning. Help restore the lake trail. Family. Friendly. Balmly. Bring glows and water." I drove over to the entrance of Hickory Landing, found Marlene standing beside a folding table with a clipboard, and held the flyer up in front of her. "What is this?" I asked. She looked at it, then looked at me. "It is a volunteer cleanup. We are clearing brush along the access route." "On my land, along the community route." "Marlene, there is no community route. There is my field." She sighed like I was making a simple thing unnecessarily difficult. "Walter, there are downed branches and overgrowth. The residents are trying to help. Nobody helps me by coming onto my property without permission. We are not harming anything. You are trespassing." She looked past me, toward a few residents gathering in the cul-de-sac. "Do you really want to make a scene over this?" I said. "You put flyers up. You made the scene. That Saturday, people still showed up. Not as many as Marlene had hoped, I imagine, but enough. A dozen adults, a few teenagers, a man carrying a chainsaw, 2 women with trash bags, little kids wearing baseball caps and carrying sticks like they were going to war. I waited until they crossed the fence line, then drove my truck down the lane and stopped in front of them. I did not yell. I did not need to. The man with the chainsaw shut it off. The whole group went quiet. I told them the land was private, that they had not been given permission to be there, and that they needed to leave. Most of them looked embarrassed. One older woman apologized and said she thought the homeowners association had arranged it. I told her I knew exactly who had arranged it. Marlene stood near the back, holding her clipboard against her chest. She did not apologize. She just stared at me with that calm, frozen expression people get when they are trying not to show they have lost control of a room. After everyone left, I drove straight to town and sat in the office of June McBride, an attorney whose father used to buy hay from mine. June was in her early 50s, sharp as a tack, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had a way of listening that made you realize she was already 3 steps ahead of what you were saying. I told her the whole story, the old permission, the new subdivision, the signs, the 4-wheelers, the cleanup day, Marlene. June leaned back in her chair and said, "Walter, kindness is not a property line." I said, "I know that now." She said, "Good, because you need to start acting like you know it." June wrote a formal letter to the Hickory Landing Board. It said the lane was private property. It said no recorded right-of-way existed. It said the old informal permission granted by my father did not create a permanent right for the neighborhood. And it said any future organized use without written permission would be considered trespass. She told me to keep records. Dates, photos, names, everything. I did exactly that. I bought a cheap black and white security camera from the farm supply store, mounted it in the old walnut tree near the fence, and ran the line back to a VCR in the machine shed. It was not fancy. Every few days I had to switch tapes, and the picture looked like something you would see on a late-night local news report, grainy and washed out. But it worked. It worked well enough to show me who removed the third sign. Part 2. The Fight. It happened on a Wednesday evening in late May of 1998. I remember because the Reds were playing on the radio, and I had just finished supper when the camera monitor in the machine shed flickered. At first I saw nothing but the edge of the lane and some tree branches moving in the breeze. Then Marlene walked into the frame. She was wearing jeans, a light jacket, and gardening gloves. She looked both ways like she was crossing a road, then walked up to the sign. I watched her take a socket wrench out of a canvas bag. I watched her loosen the bolts, lift the sign off the post, and carry it toward the subdivision. She did not look angry. That was what got me. She looked certain, like she believed she was correcting something unfair. I watched that tape 3 times before I called June. She said, "Do not go over there tonight." I said, "I was not planning to." She said, "Good, call the sheriff in the morning. Bring the tape." The deputy who came out was a young man named Ronnie Hale, polite, serious, and probably not old enough to remember when a VCR weighed 50 pounds. He watched the tape with me in the machine shed, then rewound it and watched it again. "That is definitely her," he said. "Yep, you know her?" "Better than I wanted to." He took the tape to the sheriff's office, talked to Marlene, and later told me she admitted removing the sign. She said she did it because the sign was hostile and because she believed the access route was shared community property. Deputy Hale wrote her a citation for removing post-it notice and damaging private property. It was not the kind of thing that put anybody in prison, but it was the kind of thing that made a point. Marlene called me that same afternoon. I was in the barn greasing the baler when the phone rang. I wiped my hands on a rag and picked it up. She did not say hello. She said, "You had the sheriff come to my house." I said, "No. You had the sheriff come to your house." "Over a sign, over my sign." That sign was threatening the residents. "Marlene, it said private property." "That is not a threat. That is a fact." She got quiet for a second, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was colder. "You are making enemies you do not need to make." I looked out through the barn door at my field. "I did not make anybody ride across my hay," she said. "The board is considering legal action." "Then you should tell them to bring a good map." "We are serious, Walter." "So am I." She hung up. A week later, June got a letter from an attorney in Columbus representing the Hickory Landing Homeowners Association. The letter said the association believed it had an established right of access over the lane and intended to seek relief if I continued interfering with community use. June called me into her office, put the letter on her desk and said, "Well, they finally found somebody willing to send a letter." I asked her if I should be worried. She said, "You should always take a lawyer's letter seriously, but you should not confuse a letter with a legal right." She explained that what Marlene wanted was to turn years of tolerated use into something official. The problem for her was that my father had allowed people to use the lane. Permission mattered. Permission made it harder to claim that people had been using the land against the owner's wishes, and since I had put up signs, sent letters, and documented every incident, nobody could honestly say I had quietly surrendered the property. "The longer you leave that gap open," June said, "the more they will act like it belongs to them. You need to make the boundary physical." That sentence sat with me for 2 days. I walked the property. I stood by the old gap in the fence. I looked at the tracks in the grass, the mud churned by 4-wheelers, the branches people had cut back without asking, the worn strip of earth where a path had become a habit. I thought about my father, about how he would have handled it. He would have probably gone over there with a cup of coffee, talked to people, tried to smooth it out. He was better at peace than I was. But I also knew something about my dad that most people did not. He could be gentle, but he was not weak. When somebody mistook kindness for permission to take advantage, he could get very still. And when my father got still, it usually meant somebody had just made a mistake. I called Red Callahan. Red had been my friend since high school. A big man with white hair, a beard the color of cigarette ash, and a laugh that started somewhere down around his boots. He ran a small excavation business and had helped me build the pond berm years earlier. I told him I needed to close a 14-foot gap in the south fence. He asked, "How closed are we talking?" I said, "Closed enough that nobody can drive a 4-wheeler through it, around it, under it, or convince themselves it is temporary." Red laughed once. "Well, that narrows it down." I told him what I had in mind. 6 reinforced concrete posts, 3 feet apart, set deep into a continuous footing, with heavy gauge woven wire behind them, and fresh steel fence posts running into both sides of the existing line. Not a wall, not decorative, not something a teenager could knock over with a truck, something permanent, something that said the argument had ended even if the conversation had not. Red came out the next Monday morning with a skid steer, a cement mixer, rebar forms, and his nephew Danny, who was 19 and had the face of a boy but the shoulders of a man who had lifted things for a living since he was 12. We started at 6:30 before the sun got high. Red looked at the gap and said, "You sure about this, Walt?" I said, "No, but I am sure I am done being unsure." He nodded and fired up the skid steer. By mid-morning, the trench was open. By noon, rebar was tied into place. By 2 o'clock, concrete was pouring into the forms. It was one of those bright October days where the sky looked too blue to be real, and every sound carried farther than it should. I could hear crows in the woods. I could hear the mixer turning. I could hear somebody mowing grass in Hickory Landing. And around 3 o'clock, I saw Marlene's Jeep creep past the county road for the second time. She did not stop. She did not need to. I knew she saw what we were doing. That evening, Earl Puckett came over with a 6-pack of root beer and stood by the fence watching the concrete set. "Looks serious," he said. "It is serious. You think this will settle it?" I looked at those wet grey posts and said, "It will settle whether they can drive through here." Earl took a bottle from the pack and handed it to me. That is usually where settling starts. The next day, Red set the woven wire and steel posts. On the third day, he mounted 2 cameras, one pointed toward Hickory Landing, the other down the lane toward my barn. I hung a weatherproof sign beside the gate. PRIV date property. Pedestrian, HGSS by W written, permission only, no motorist vehicles, no motorcycles, no organized events, no trespassing. It was a plain sign, no threats, no insults, no angry language, just facts. When Red finished, he stepped back, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said, "Well, Walt, if they want through that now, they are going to need a helicopter." I said, "Do not give them ideas." Marlene called at 6:15 that evening. I was sitting at the kitchen table eating leftover meatloaf when the phone rang. I let it ring twice before I picked up. "You built concrete posts," she said. "I did. You blocked the access route. I closed a gap in my fence. You cannot just cut an entire neighborhood off from the lake." "Marlene, the lake is still there. The roads are still there. Nothing is cut off. People just have to use the roads built for them instead of my hayfield." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are doing this to punish people." I looked down at my plate. "No, I am doing this because people punished me every time they decided my no did not count." She said, "The board will not accept this." "Then the board can come look at the fence. It is not moving." 3 days later, the association filed for an emergency court order asking a judge to make me remove the barrier while they argued their claim. June called me after she got the paperwork. "They are asking for temporary relief," she said. "They want the court to treat the lane like it belongs to them until the case is sorted out." I said, "And what do we say?" She said, "We say the truth. We say there was no deed, no recorded easement, no agreement, no necessity, and no right to use your property just because it was convenient." The hearing was held in the old county courthouse in January of 1999. It was cold enough that morning to freeze the water in the bird bath outside my porch. I wore my good grey suit, the same one I wore to my father's funeral, and I hated that I had to wear it to defend something he had spent his life working for. Marlene sat across the courtroom with 2 HOA board members. She had a folder full of papers, a stack of old development brochures, and that same determined look on her face. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. She had convinced herself she was standing up for people who had been misled. Maybe some of them had been. But somewhere along the way, she decided that being wronged by a developer gave her permission to wrong somebody else. Her lawyer talked about community reliance, access, family recreation, and the way the route had been used for years. June stood up and talked about property boundaries, written permission, signs, documented objections, the removal of those signs, and the simple fact that nobody had the right to turn a favor into a permanent claim because it saved them a few minutes of driving. The judge was an older man named Harold Sinclair. He listened without much expression, flipping through papers and occasionally adjusting his glasses. At one point, Marlene's attorney held up the developer brochure and pointed to a green line near the reservoir. The residents reasonably believed they would have access, he said. Judge Sinclair looked at the paper for a long second, then said, "Counselor, a colored line on a brochure is not a deed." You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. The judge denied the emergency request. He did not say the Homeowners Association had no right to argue its case later, but he made it clear they had not shown enough reason to force me to tear down a lawful fence on my own property. Outside the courthouse, Marlene caught me near the steps. She looked tired, not angry exactly, just tired in a way I had not seen before. "You think you won," she said. I looked at her, then at the courthouse doors behind her. "No, Marlene. I think I got to keep what was already mine." She stared at me for a moment. "People are going to remember this," I said. "I hope they do." Part 3. The end. For a few weeks after the hearing, things got quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm when you are not sure whether the clouds are gone or just catching their breath. Nobody tried to break through the posts. Nobody touched the signs. I still checked the cameras every morning, more out of habit than fear. I could not tell you what changed in me during that time. Something did. Before all of this, I had thought being a good neighbor meant making room for people. After all of it, I realized being a good neighbor also meant making the rules clear enough that nobody had to guess where one person's kindness ended and another person's entitlement began. In February, I got a phone call from someone I did not expect. It was Millie Grant, an older woman who lived in Hickory Landing with her husband. I knew her by sight because I had seen her walking the old lane with a little black terrier and a red knit cap. She had never caused trouble. She had always stayed off the field, kept the dog close, and waved when she passed my barn. She called and said, "Walter, I hope you do not mind me asking, but is there any chance you would talk to Marlene one more time?" I said, "Why?" She paused, then said, "Because not everybody in that neighborhood wanted this fight. Some of us just wanted to walk to the lake. We did not know about the signs, the meetings, or the legal letters until it got ugly." I sat there with the phone in my hand, looking out at the snow on the field. Millie was not asking for a shortcut. She was asking for something quieter, something human, and I could not shake the thought that Dad would have listened to her. So I called June. I asked her what kind of agreement I could make that allowed a small number of people to walk through but kept everything else under control. She said, "You can make a limited written license. It would not give the neighborhood ownership. It would not give them vehicle access. It would be revocable if they break the rules. You decide the path, the hours, the use, and the conditions." I thought about it for a week. Then I called Marlene. She did not answer, so I left a message on her answering machine. I said, "Marlene, this is Walter Boone. I am willing to talk if you are willing to listen." She called back an hour later. Her voice was different, quieter. She came to my house the following Saturday morning. It had snowed overnight, and the world outside looked clean in that way. It only does, after a fresh snowfall, like nobody had ever driven a four-wheeler across anything or taken down a sign or filed a lawsuit. I made coffee. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Dad used to sort seed catalogs and pay bills with a pencil behind his ear. For a while, neither of us said much. Finally, she looked at the window and said, "I thought I was fighting for the neighborhood." I said, "Maybe you were, but you were fighting on my land." She nodded slowly. "The developer told people there would be lake access. Then he lied to them. I know that now. Knowing it now does not fix the ruts in my field." "No," she said, "it does not." I told her I had a proposal. I said I would allow a narrow footpath along the wooded edge of the property, not through the hayfield, not past the barn, not near the cattle. The path would be for walking only. No four-wheelers, no dirt bikes, no bicycles, no group cleanups, no HOA events, no flyers, no cutting branches, no one after dark. People could use it from sunrise to sunset, and if the rules were broken, I could shut it down with 30 days' notice. I would put everything in writing. The Homeowners Association would pay for the legal work, put up a small liability policy, and send every resident a copy of the rules. Marlene listened without interrupting. Then she said, "What about the old lane?" I said. "The old lane is closed, permanently, as permanently concrete gets." She gave a small laugh at that, not because it was funny exactly, but because there was nothing left to argue about. Then she said, "The truth is, most people wanted the four-wheelers. That was the real fight." I nodded. "I know. And you are not going to budge on that. No. And you are not going to budge on that. No." She looked down at her coffee. I would not either if it was my field. That was the first honest thing she had said to me in almost a year. 3 weeks later, June finished the agreement. The Hickory Landing Board voted on it. Not everyone was happy. I heard a few residents called me stubborn. One man supposedly said I was holding the lake hostage. Earl told me that part with a grin and said I told him the lake has been there longer than his mortgage. But most people accepted it. Maybe they were tired of the fight. Maybe they realized the alternative was driving around the highway forever. Maybe they finally understood that the man whose property they had been crossing had not actually been the villain in the story. The footpath opened in April of 1999. Red helped me clear a narrow route along the tree line, just wide enough for 2 people to pass each other. We put up a small wooden sign that said, "Pine Run Footpath. Walkers only. Daylight hours. Respect the land. Walkers only. Daylight hours. Respect the land." It was not fancy. No gold letters. No brochure promises. Just a path, a rule, and a boundary. The first people I saw using it were Millie Grant and her husband. They walked slowly, both carrying fishing poles, and Millie waved to me from the edge of the woods. A few minutes later, 2 kids from Hickory Landing came through with their grandfather, each of them holding a little plastic tackle box. They stayed on the path. They closed the gate behind them. They did not leave trash. They did not make a mess. I stood there by the barn and watched them disappear toward the lake. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something in my chest loosen. Marlene came by later that summer, not on a 4-wheeler, not in her Jeep, but on foot. She was walking with her son, who had grown taller over the past year, and looked embarrassed to be seen with his mother. They stopped near the new gate. Marlene looked at the concrete posts behind her, then at the footpath ahead. "You know," she said, "I hated those posts at first." I said I figured that. She gave me a tired little smile. Now I think they were the only thing that made everybody finally understand where the line was. I looked at the field, at the old gap that was gone now, and said, "Sometimes people need a line they can see." She nodded, then walked on. "I still have those concrete posts. They are weathered now, a little stained from rain and winter salt, but they have not moved an inch. The woven wire behind them is still tight. The cameras are gone, because after a while, I did not need them anymore. Nobody has removed another sign. Nobody has driven a 4-wheeler across the field. And a footpath is still there, quiet and narrow along the woods, used by people who understand it is a privilege, not a possession. I think about my father sometimes when I look at it. He would have handled the beginning differently, I know that. He might have talked longer. He might have given more chances. But I also think he would have understood the ending. My father believed in a handshake, but he also believed a man had a right to protect what he worked for. He gave people room because he trusted them. I gave people rules because I learned what happens when trust gets passed from person to person until nobody remembers where it came from. So tell me what you think. Was I right to close the old lane and pour those concrete posts? Or should I have let the neighborhood keep using the shortcut because my father once said yes? Was Marlene wrong for pushing the issue? Or was she trying to fix a problem a developer created and just chose the wrong person to fight? And if you have ever had a neighbor, an HOA, or a whole community start treating your property like it belonged to everybody but you, leave your story in the comments. Share this with somebody who believes a favor and a legal right are the same thing, because they are not. A favor can be given. A favor can be taken back. But once people start calling your kindness a tradition, you had better make the boundary clear before somebody else decides it belongs to them.